Welcome to another episode in the Reading Through the Gospel series. This is a 20-week Bible study video series reading through the life of Jesus Christ in the Gospel of Mark. Last week we read through chapter 7. We had Jesus versus the traditional food laws. Jesus versus the Pharisees. Talked about that quite a bit. And we had possibly the weirdest healing in the Gospel. That was chapter 7. This week we have Mark chapter 8. We start with a story that looks somewhat familiar, pretty similar to a story we had just a few chapters ago. We start with the feeding of the 4,000. And I believe it was chapter 6, just a few chapters ago, we had the feeding of the 5,000. So what I have in the footnotes here of this Bible is that these are quite possibly just one event told in two different ways, like passed down through the different versions. There's like a Jewish version and a Gentile version possibly, but the details within the story are a little bit different. For example, here in the feeding of the 4,000, we have 7 loaves and a few fish versus 5 loaves and 2 fish in the feeding of the 5,000, and they end up with 7 baskets of fragments left over versus 12 baskets of fragments left over in the feeding of the 5,000. So some of the details are kind of different, but overall it's pretty similar. Lots of people, not a lot of food, bread and fish. And we also have the details in here where Jesus breaks the bread and gives thanks. And that piece is maybe a nod to the Last Supper, whereas the same language, Jesus broke bread, gave thanks, and gave the bread, is the same thing, the same kind of language that we have in the Last Supper. So I think there's probably a reference there. Either way, these mass feeding miracle stories give us the meaning of faith brings us abundance. We will never go hungry if we trust in the Lord. He will provide. And it's an amazing miracle. From there, the 12 and Jesus go off to a different place where they're met by Pharisees who are seeking a sign from Jesus, kind of testing him, wanting to prove himself by some kind of grand sign. And interestingly, in verse 12, it says, he sighed from the depth of his spirit, which is like significant language here. Jesus sighed from the depth of his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? And how true is that still for us, knowing the end of this story, even believing in Jesus, who he says he is? Why are we still seeking a sign, Jesus says? How much have I already done for you? And you continue to ask me in our prayers that we offer to the Lord, Lord, send me a sign, show me the way. All the time. I'm so guilty of it, saying in my prayer, like, Lord, just show me. Lord, just give me something clear. Let me know what you want from me. And he says, why do you seek a sign? Why do you seek so much more from me? Have I not already shown and proven my worth, my goodness to you? Why do we seek a sign? Maybe a message for us there too. The group gets back in the boat and they realize they don't really have much bread among them. There's like 1 loaf with them in the boat. And Jesus says something that's like maybe out of context here, maybe kind of random, but he says, guard against the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, which I would probably say is also confusing and was apparently confusing to the 12 because it says that the 12 just think that he's talking about bread. But it's supposed to be some kind of symbolic meaning. The footnotes have a connection to a part of the book of First Corinthians, and it talks about that leaven or yeast, something that we put into bread that causes the dough to rise, and that yeast or leaven causes all of the dough to rise, not just certain parts. So possibly what Jesus is saying here, speaking symbolically, is guard yourself from the way that these Pharisees are thinking. Guard yourself from the argument, the need for the sign, the criticism. Because if you go along with them, they are the yeast that cause all to rise. So if you fall into that idea, then you get taken up by this yeast in the same way. But of course, the apostles don't really understand this. They think that he's just talking about bread, which, to be fair, I might also think he's just talking about bread. That it seems just a little bit confusing, but nonetheless, at this point, again, disciples, the 12, still are not really catching on to what Jesus is talking about, don't really understand his miracles, all of that stuff. Another weird healing story here. They get to Bethsaida, and there's a blind man, and Jesus essentially just like rubs spit in his eyes. And originally, so he does it twice. The first time, he rubs spit in his eyes, and he says to the man, "What do you see?" And the man gives this weird response. He says, "I see people looking like trees and walking," as if he was like on some kind of psychedelic drugs or something. But then Jesus does it again, second time, and the man can see clearly. It's tricky to try to understand, why is this part included in here? Why does it seem like the man is on some kind of psychedelics talking about people looking like trees and walking around? But it might be symbolic for what we just saw in the last section about how the 12 are really just struggling to understand the way that Jesus is speaking and the way that Jesus is acting in ways that might seem clear, but that they're slow to pick up. And in this same way, the man is not able to see clearly right away, but it's a gradual healing. So there might be a reference there, and I think that's what we're going to go with. Because at this point, we have kind of a theme up to this point that the 12 are just not really picking up what Jesus is putting down, and they're just generally confused up until now. We are at a turning point in the gospel here. This section right here, not only because it's halfway, and interesting because it's right about halfway through the Gospel of Mark, but this is a turning point in the gospel because they start to believe thanks to Peter. They're on the way to Caesarea Philippi. Jesus asks them, "Who do people say that I am?" And the general response is like John the Baptist, Elijah, genuinely a prophet. People think at this point that Jesus is probably some kind of prophet. And Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Messiah." It's the first time anyone says it in the gospel. This is the turning point where Jesus goes from just a healer, a prophet, a significant person to Messiah. And the first time that anyone has identified him as such. And here in Mark's version of the gospel, there isn't any kind of expanding on that, and there's no follow-up to Peter saying that. In other versions of the gospel, like in Matthew and in Luke, Jesus says to Peter, who is Simon up to this point in the other gospels, he would say to him, "Simon, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Peter being Cephas, being rock. Peter, on this rock I'll build my church. There's a very significant point in the other gospels that it's Peter who says that, and then Peter becomes like top tier apostle and becomes the first pope of the church and all this kind of stuff. But this is the turning point, because from here on out, Jesus has gone from prophet and healer to Messiah, and Jesus says you cannot tell anyone about this, because the more people find out about this, the more that this idea starts to become popular, the more danger Jesus is in. And from here, we have crossed the point of Jesus going from nobody to popular, but now from going to popular to like danger. For the rest of the gospel here, we will have Jesus's movement towards his passion, his crucifixion, and his death, which is what Jesus then talks about to the 12. He explains to them what this means for him to be the Messiah, that he is going to suffer greatly, be rejected, and be killed. And they probably don't receive that very well, especially Peter, who it says pulls Jesus aside, rebukes him, probably says, "No, Lord, you can't do this." And there's not as much detail in the Gospel of Mark, more details in other Gospels. But nonetheless, we still have this response from Jesus. When Peter pulls him aside and says, "No, you can't go through with this," Jesus responds to him in like maybe the most harsh way. He turns around and says, "Get behind me, Satan," to Peter. He says, "Get behind me, Satan." You are thinking not as God does, but as humans do. That Peter doesn't understand what needs to happen, and for some reason, Jesus says, "No," like in the most forceful way possible, "Get behind me, Satan." Like, no, you are getting in the way of salvation. I must do this. So this is the significant point. We now, moving forward, understand Jesus as Messiah, but then what does that mean for us is what we have in the final section of this chapter. Jesus saying to both the 12 and a larger crowd. And read this whole part because it's important, significant, and I like it. "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and that of the gospel will save it. What profit is there for one to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? What could one give in exchange for his life? Whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this faithless and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." Super significant right here, and that is like the meaning of super significant here, and this is really our like calling, the conditions of being a disciple of Christ. I think pretty self-explanatory, but really saying that this life is fleeting, that this life that we have now here on earth is fleeting, is nothing compared to eternity. What Jesus is promising us for everlasting life in heaven, the glory of heaven, that if we try to gain everything in this life but miss out on that, then we're throwing everything away. That we have to think like long term, that we have to think of greater, of eternity, that our life is not entirely about what we can gain here on earth. It's not all about us. It's not about how much we can accumulate. It's not about how wonderful and how fun and our life can be on this earth, but there's something greater and there's something to strive for. And I think that's really cool because that gives us purpose. Our life is not only about going day by day, just trying to, do the best that we can to achieve some kind of glory in this life, but it's a more ultimate and eternal goal. And I think this provides the adventure for us in our life, that our life has an end goal, which is heaven, which is the ultimate goal, the goal that we were made for. But to get there means for us to daily sacrifice, to give of ourselves, surrender ourselves, and take up our cross and follow the way of Christ. That is the adventure. That is the life we have. Because that, to me, is more exciting than how much money can I make, how can I have the coolest things, how can I have the most pleasurable, exciting life. I think the higher calling for us, something that is more exciting, is the possibility of eternity in heaven. And to get there, we take up our cross. We sacrifice every day, which is a challenge. It provides us a challenge. It provides us a direction. It provides us purpose in our life, something to strive for, and something to challenge us, make us better day by day, sacrificing, taking up our cross, and following the way of Christ to achieve the eternal goal of heaven. These are the conditions of being a disciple of Christ. Cool stuff. Significant chapter, and like we said, the turning point in the Gospel of Mark. So here on forward, we're moving towards the end and towards Christ's passion and death. 8 more chapters to go. We're halfway through this series, so hopefully you've been enjoying it so far. Leave a like and let me know down in the comments below if you have. This was chapter 8 in the Gospel of Mark. Hopefully I'll see you again next week for Mark chapter 9.